But first, there are two basic responses that most of us have to protests. The first is to say that protesters are a bunch of disruptive thugs who should be dispersed by police. The second is to say that, well, the protesters have got a reasonable grievance that ought to be addressed by government. Last year, when Melbourne had Black Lives Matter protests and later anti-lockdown protests, the ABC, for instance, and the Andrews government made excuses for the former and condemned the latter. Last year, no BLM marchers were arrested, although a couple of organisers copped a small fine. But as we know, reported at the time, hundreds of anti-lockdown protesters were arrested. Until today, it looked like we were getting a reenactment of the same double standards as last year, with police largely leaving alone left-wing protesters like construction unionists protesting last Friday about the closure of their tea rooms and again yesterday protesting out the front of the CFMEU's head office against compulsory vaccinations for building workers. All very different, of course, to the scenes from Saturday's anti-lockdown protests where Victoria Police, in full riot gear, arrested hundreds. We saw widespread scenes of violence there too, with some appearing to even be violence by police against protesters and as claimed by photographers against the media too, as much as it was the other way around. But today in Melbourne's CBD, the police turned up for a left-wing protest. And so the left then tried to deny that the protesters had anything to do with them. Now, I can't help but think construction workers protesting against their own union must have been a bit surreal for John Setka, one of the country's most militant and foul-mouthed union leaders who fronts the Victorian branch of the CFMEU. The CFMEU is no stranger to protests, as you know. It's just almost unheard of for members to move against their own leader. But that's what happened to the bloke accustomed to stand outside building sites ranting about dogs and scabs. That's Setka, getting a taste of his own medicine yesterday. Take a look. But here's where it gets interesting. Last night and again today, instead of accepting that many of his union members were unhappy about being subjected to mandatory vaccinations and the forced shutdown of their industry for the next 14 days, Setka decided that they weren't really his members after all, despite the abundance of high-vis and construction company logos worn by protesters. According to Setka, the people outside his office yesterday and again in the streets of Melbourne today weren't construction workers at all. No, he said, Setka, they were drunken, fascist, anti-un-Australian morons. Here he is.
I believe there was. I wouldn't know one if I fell over one, to be quite honest, Carl, but I mean, my understanding is, yes, there's a few of them anti-vaxxer activists were there who are not union members, they're not from our industry, and they're the ones you see at all the protests. So, like I said, it just got out of control, and thanks to these, and then they were consuming a whole heap of alcohol, and thanks to these morons, 300,000 Victorians are sitting at home for at least the next couple of weeks, could drag out even longer, and it's just tragic.
The union said that the protest had been hijacked by outside extremists and infiltrated by neo-Nazis. You know the left are desperate when they start talking about neo-Nazis. Was every protester today a card-carrying member of the CFMEU? Impossible to say. But I've seen plenty of CFMEU protests in my time, and the bulk of the crowd looked true to form. There was a handful with anti-vaxxer messages scrawled across their high-vis, but being anti-vaxxer and a genuine tradie is hardly mutually exclusive. And the fact too that, again, police today, like yesterday, made almost no arrests, although we're getting it into the newsroom tonight. There's around 44 arrests. Still a lot less than we saw on the weekend at the anti-lockdown protests. This is all despite that squad line outside State Parliament today and the protesters marching all the way through Melbourne streets and even blocking the West Gate Freeway. This makes me think it's overwhelmingly a bunch of disaffected union members sick of nanny state rules stopping them from working at their jobs and earning their wages. Now, I agree people shouldn't break the law, even if the law is unreasonable, as so many of these health orders are. But that isn't what's telling in these protests. What's telling is that it's not just small business owners and the anti-vaxxer crowd fighting against draconian restrictions in Victoria. You've got online groups of mums demanding schools open up. And now you've got the most militant of militant unions fighting against its own. Don't forget the CFMEU's history. It makes up around 1% of the Australian workforce with an actual membership of 144,000 members. It's got assets as a union worth $310 million and per annum a revenue base of approximately $146 million. That's revenue per year, $146 million. You can see why they're so powerful, can't you? And why they play such a crucial role for Labor governments, Labor oppositions. They want to keep them happy, given unions help fund Labor election campaigns year in, year out. It's also worth restating the legal record of the CFMEU too, because it's a doozy. Since the Australian Building and Construction Commission was re-established in 2016, a key election commitment of the Abbott government, I might add, and bitterly opposed by Labor, the CFMEU has been hit with over $12.8 million in fines and penalties for breaking the law. To date, there's been 69 cases taken through the courts with over 100 union officials involved. See what I mean about the CFMEU being a militant union? Those numbers tell us everything. Now, was I surprised to see that Daniel Andrews didn't front the media today? No, I wasn't, because he's in a bit of a bind. His health restrictions are starting to really bite amongst his own people. And these sort of scenes, with workers in high vis rising up against their natural Labor support base, won't make for comfortable viewing amongst Labor strategists or their masters down at Trades Hall. Eventually, the Victorian Premier will have to come out of his bunker and deal with what we saw in Melbourne's streets today. It's funny how the same mandatory vaccination rule was required of the construction industry in New South Wales, and there hasn't been any protests. It just shows, doesn't it, in Victoria, the culture of entitlement and expectations of concessions to the CFMEU that Setka has demanded and Andrews has long created. One thing this protest has already achieved, though, the CFMEU is now against mandatory vaccinations. And given that the CFMEU is one of the biggest donors to Labor, one thing's all but certain: part of the deal to reopen building sites will be the Andrews government drops the demand that workers get jabbed or be sacked. The problem for Daniel Andrews is you reap what you sow.